What stood out most from this latest Detroit Lions draft conversation is that Brad Holmes and Dan Campbell are clearly still building this roster around identity first and talent second. That might sound strange to some people, but when you look closely at players like Skylar Gill-Howard and Kendrick Law, you start to understand exactly what this front office values most. And honestly, it feels very familiar to what has already made this team successful. Let's start with Skylar Gill-Howard, because his story alone feels like something that could define what the Lions want in their locker room. This is not a player who had the easy path. He is the oldest of 10 children, a guy who played running back and linebacker in high school, even joined the wrestling team just to improve his football recruitment chances because he was obsessed with finding a way to stay in the game. Then COVID hit during his senior year, and like so many players, his recruiting opportunities collapsed. Instead of giving up, he went to Division II Upper Iowa University. He entered the transfer portal in 2021 after just one season, but the first wave of offers never came. Then the second wave came, and still nothing. At that point, he got a job at FedEx, started coaching track at his old high school, and was close to walking away from football completely. He admitted himself that he almost threw in the towel, but he believed he was meant for more. That belief led him to Northern Illinois, and even there, things were not easy. He didn't receive a scholarship. He kept working at FedEx for 2 more years while attending classes and playing football. At the same time, NIU asked him to completely change his body and his position. He went from being a 230-pound running back and linebacker to a 280-pound defensive lineman in just 4 months. Think about that for a second. That kind of transformation is not normal. That takes discipline, sacrifice, and a mindset that fits perfectly with what Detroit has built. Even now, he is considered undersized for a defensive tackle at around 280 pounds. But that almost feels like something Brad Holmes actively looks for. We have seen this before with Mekhi Wingo, the idea that maybe there is another disruptive interior defender hiding in a body people overlook. Someone who wins with leverage, violence, and relentless effort rather than just size. Gill-Howard himself embraces that. He understands leverage is his game. And when you hear coaches talk about him, when you see how quickly fans are starting to connect with his story, it feels like one of those late round picks that could quietly become much bigger than expected. What makes it even more interesting is the flexibility. Players like him and Wingo can be used creatively. They can line up inside, outside, move pieces around, maybe even create situations where someone like Aiden Hutchinson gets shifted inside more often. That kind of versatility matters when you are trying to build a defensive line that can survive a full NFL season. And after Northern Illinois developed him, he bet on himself one more time by entering the portal again. This time, over 25 schools wanted him. He chose Texas Tech, giving himself the chance to prove he could dominate not just against MAC competition, but in the Big 12 as well. That matters. That matters a lot. This is exactly why the transfer portal can be a success story. Without it, there is a real chance Skylar Gill-Howard never reaches the NFL. Instead, he kept fighting, kept improving, and now he lands in Detroit, a place that probably values that journey as much as the actual production. Then there is Kendrick Law, and this pick feels different, but just as intentional. The Lions traded up 13 spots, moving from pick 181 to 168, and giving up pick 213 to go get him. When a team moves up on day 3, it tells you they were targeting someone specifically. They did not want to risk losing him. Law brings something really interesting to this offense. First, the athletic profile jumps off the page. His relative athletic score sits around 9.6, and if he were slightly taller, it could have pushed near elite territory. His explosiveness stands out immediately, but what really shocks people is the strength. 21 bench press reps at 225 pounds as a wide receiver. That is not normal. That tells you this is not just some speed-only gadget player. This is someone who loves the weight room, someone who embraces physical football. And when you watch his tape, there is a strong feeling that he could actually be more effective in the NFL than he was in college. At Kentucky, he had 53 catches on 64 targets, an incredibly efficient number. He averaged 10.2 yards per catch, but the real story was what happened after the catch. He ranked 6th in all of college football in yards after catch, with an average depth of target of just over 5 yards. In simple terms, Kentucky got the ball into his hands quickly and told him to go create. That makes him feel like a faster, stronger version of the kind of role Khalif Raymond used to bring. Someone who can be the gadget player, the motion guy, the special teams weapon, the wrinkle in the offense defenses have to prepare for. And he also logged over 500 special team snaps. That is huge for making the roster. The Lions already have Amon-Ra St., Brown, Jameson Williams, and others at the top of the receiver room, but depth matters. After those top names, competition opens up quickly. That is where Kendrick Law can immediately fight for a real roster spot. There is even a thought that his physical profile could allow him to be used in running back packages. At nearly 5'11", 205 pounds, with that kind of strength and explosiveness, it would not be shocking to see Detroit experiment with him there, especially considering they did not do much at running back in the draft. That is what makes these picks so fascinating. They are not just random late-round swings, they are targeted bets on toughness, versatility, and upside. And when you look at how this roster is being shaped, it becomes clear this is still the same philosophy. Find players who fit Detroit before anything else. The question now is simple. Between Skylar Gill-Howard and Kendrick Law, which one do you believe has the better chance to become the biggest surprise for the Lions this season? And that is where this draft starts to get even more interesting, because once you move past the headline names and the first 2 rounds, you begin to see how Detroit is trying to quietly solve long-term depth problems before they become major issues during the season. One of the best examples of that is the wide receiver room itself, because on the surface, many fans probably looked at the Kendrick Law pick and thought, why wide receiver? But when you really break down the depth chart, it starts to make much more sense. At the top, yes, you feel comfortable. You have Amon-Ra St. Brown as the clear leader of that room. You have Jameson Williams bringing explosive speed. You have Tesla from last year continuing to develop. Then you add Greg Dortch, who gives you another reliable option and helps replace some of what Khalif Raymond brought to the offense. But after that, things get thinner than people realize. You start talking about names like Tom Kennedy, Dominic Lovett out of Georgia, Jackson Meeks, who they have even discussed potentially moving toward a tight end role, and Malik Cunningham. Suddenly, Kendrick Law is not buried on the depth chart at all. He is immediately competing for that 5th receiver spot, and in Detroit, that role matters because special teams value is everything. That is why his profile becomes so important. This is not just about catches. This is about whether he can block, whether he can handle gadget plays, whether he can survive on special teams, whether he can be trusted in motion packages and in physical situations near the line of scrimmage. That bench press number matters because it shows he is not afraid of contact. Some receivers are pure space players. Law looks like the kind of player who can take a swing pass, break a tackle, and then turn around and block a linebacker on the next snap. That is the type of versatility offensive coordinators love. There is even a very real football argument that he could eventually take some snaps in the backfield, and honestly, that would not be shocking at all. Look at the current running back situation. The Lions did not make a major move there. The room is built around Jahmyr Gibbs, Isaiah Pacheco, and Sione Vaki. That is solid, but it is not incredibly deep, and injuries happen fast in this league. If Kendrick Law gives you emergency flexibility there, that becomes another reason why Brad Holmes may have seen more in him than the average fan did on draft night. This is the same front office that found Amon-Ra St. Brown and believed he would become a better pro than college player. That is the challenge with players like Kendrick Law. Looking past the college box score and projecting how the NFL environment could unlock more. Sometimes college football hides NFL talent because of quarterback inconsistency, offensive structure, or simply how players are used. Detroit clearly believes Law could be one of those cases. And then there is another defensive name that quietly keeps coming up, Tyree West. This is someone the Lions have not fully broken down yet, but the early reaction is that his tape pops immediately. His size almost does not make sense when you first look at it. He is around 6'3" and nearly 300 pounds while being listed as an edge defender. That creates a really interesting conversation because his role may not be as simple as edge rusher. He feels like one of those hybrid defensive linemen who can move all over the front depending on the matchup. In a strange way, he almost mirrors the conversation around Skylar Gill-Howard, but in reverse. Gill-Howard is listed more like a defensive tackle who might be able to move outside. Tyree West looks like an edge who might be able to move inside. That flexibility is exactly what Detroit needs because the defensive line remains one of the biggest questions heading into the season. You still have Aleem McNeil working his way back from injury, and everyone knows how important he is when healthy. His return changes everything for the interior. Then there is the constant need to support Aiden Hutchinson so offenses cannot simply throw all their protection his way. That is why these later picks matter so much. Maybe Tyree West has the higher physical ceiling. Maybe Skylar Gill-Howard has the stronger underdog story and the safer cultural fit. Maybe Mekhi Wingo takes the next major leap. But somewhere in that group, Detroit needs real contributors, not just camp bodies. Because this team is no longer drafting for survival, they are drafting for championship depth. That is the difference. A few years ago, late round picks were about finding starters because the roster needed everything. Now, late round picks are about finding rotational players who can keep a contender strong through December, January, and hopefully beyond. That is a much harder job, and honestly, it says a lot about how far this franchise has come. The Lions also made it clear with this draft that defense was still the main focus. 5 of the 7 selections were defensive players, and that feels intentional. Fans spent months debating best player available versus positional need. But once the first major needs were addressed early, Detroit allowed itself to take smart swings on upside later. That balance matters. They did not force picks just to check boxes. They stayed true to their board, but still made sure the roster improved where it had to improve. Interestingly, tight end was another position they did not prioritize in the draft, and that raised some eyebrows. Running back, too. Those are areas fans will keep watching, especially with undrafted free agents and offseason roster moves still to come. Because the draft is never really finished when the final pick is made, the real evaluation starts now. OTAs are coming. Rookie minicamp is coming. Position battles are coming. And sometimes the player everyone talks about in April is not the same player everyone is talking about in August. That is why these stories matter. Maybe Skylar Gill-Howard becomes the next fan favorite grinder who earns his role the hard way. Maybe Kendrick Law becomes the surprise offensive weapon nobody expected. Maybe Tyree West turns into the defensive line chess piece this front office has been searching for. That is what makes this stage of the offseason so fascinating. Now I want to hear from you. If you had to bet on one late round pick right now to become a true impact player for Detroit, who would it be and why? And the deeper you look into this roster, the clearer it becomes that Brad Holmes is not just drafting players, he is drafting competition. That might be the most important part of this entire process. Because when training camp opens, nobody is going to be handed anything for free, especially with these late round selections. Every single one of these players is walking into a situation where they have to earn trust first. And for the Lions, trust is everything. Take Skylar Gill-Howard again. His biggest battle is not just proving he belongs physically, it is proving he can survive in a defensive line rotation that desperately needs reliability. Detroit has had flashes on the interior before, but true depth has been inconsistent. Too often, when injuries hit, the drop-off became obvious. That is why players like Gill-Howard matter so much. If he can become part of that second wave rotation, someone who can give quality snaps without the defense falling apart, that changes the entire structure of the front 7. Suddenly, Aiden Hutchinson is fresher late in games. Suddenly, Aleem McNeil does not have to carry such a heavy load returning from injury. Suddenly, offensive lines cannot simply survive by targeting weak spots. And for a player like Gill-Howard, that opportunity is real because effort players tend to find favor quickly in Detroit. Coaches can teach technique, they can adjust hand placement, they